Okay, so thank you all for joining us for the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship Program Workshop. Joining us today is Dr. Andrew Hansen, the Dean of the Honors College. He's going to discuss the application process for the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship Program and how to secure NSF funding. And now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Hansen to get us started.
All right, thank you, Jasmine. So before I start sharing my screen and go through the key parts of the Graduate Fellowship Program, I thought it would be helpful for me if I know a little bit of information about the participants who are joining us today. So either if you want to turn your microphone on and answer in person, that would be great, or if not, answer in the chat. But the first question I have for all of you is it would be helpful for me to know what year you are at UNLV. And let me know whether you're an undergrad, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, or if you're a graduate student, first year, second year, and for the grad students, if you're a master's or a PhD. So if you can answer that question, that would be great. And I will wait to either hear your responses or to see them in the chat.
I'm a sociology PhD student in my 4th year.
Okay, great, thank you.
I'm technically an undergrad. I'm in the integrated BS-MS mechanical engineering program, but I'm gonna try to pursue grad school outside of UNLV, and that's why I'm here.
Okay, thanks, Dakota. Okay, cool. All right. So I think most people have now answered. So I'm glad I asked this question because there's some of you who I'm going to tell that you're not eligible for the NSF graduate program, and I'm glad that you showed up today, but I don't want you to waste your time sitting through this presentation if you're not eligible. So Kayla, I am sorry to tell you that students from kinesiology are not eligible for the NSF GRFP. So you're welcome to stick around if you'd like, but you wouldn't be able to apply for this program. And then let's see, physics is included. Doctoralson in psychological and brain science, that would be fine. Mechanical engineering is good. So Sharon, I want to just clarify one thing with you. You wrote that you were a PhD student in computer science in your last year. Do you mean that you are finishing your PhD right now? So you're gonna, as I understand it, you're gonna finish your PhD next semester. If that's the case, you also would be, you're in an eligible field, but you are past the time when you would be applying for a GRFP because you apply either your first or second year of graduate school if you're a grad student to fund your program that's going to follow. So if you're actually graduating next semester, there would be no point in you applying for the scholarship because this is to fund students who are in graduate school. So as best I can tell from your answers, this probably is not something that would be relevant for you as well. I think for everybody else, you're okay. Marlena in urban leadership, I have less familiarity with how the GRFP works for students outside of the STEM fields, but it is an option for different non-STEM areas. And I have a screen here that I'll show about the third slide in that lists all of the different areas that are eligible for NSF graduate funding. And so you'll want to look at that carefully to see if in fact that works for you. And let's see, Dakota, you're pursuing a graduate program. Yep, that's all good. That will work just fine, Dakota, no problem. Okay, so now that I know a bit about you and hopefully we've got people who this program would make sense for, I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I have a PowerPoint that will walk through all the key points about applying for NSF GRFP. And I think once I do that, I may lose my connection to chat. So if there's a question, Nevino or Jasmine or someone, if you can chime in, I don't have a problem with anybody interrupting me to ask a question, or any of the students who are on the call. That's just fine too. So let me start sharing my screen, and we will kick this thing off. Okay. All right, so I just want to make sure that you guys are seeing a screen that says NSF Graduate Research Fellowship Program. Can somebody confirm that that is what you're seeing? Okay, thank you, Dakota. All right, so as was stated in the introduction, I'm Dr. Andrew Hansen. I'm currently the Dean of the Honors College. But to give you a bit of relevance for this, my disciplinary area is geology, and prior to becoming the Dean and the Associate Dean of the Honors College, I was a full-time faculty member in the Department of Geoscience here at UNLV for about 12 years. And starting in my time when I was still in the Geoscience department and continuing on into my time in administration in the Honors College, I have served on the review panel for the GRFP, as it's known, probably about, I don't know, 6 or 7 different times. And so the information I'm going to share with you comes in part from that experience, but also obviously the information that National Science Foundation has shared on their website about the GRFP. So if you do a simple Google search after this and just type in NSF GRFP, you will find a link that will take you to the key parts related to this program. All applications for the GRFP are done through NSF, and I will warn you that their instructions on their website, at least in my view, are a bit like reading the owner manual on the repair of a washing machine. They are not simple, straightforward, although to give them credit, they are thorough and complete and very detailed. So I'm going to try to hopefully simplify some of that information that's on their website, but that ultimately is the place you would go, is to NSF's website, obviously. Okay, so let me advance this, and I'm gonna start by talking through what a GRFP is. So it is a fellowship that's primarily for STEM students, although not exclusively, as you'll see here in a minute, and it supports students who are in particular disciplines as they pursue graduate education. For the students who receive the fellowship, they get 3 years of financial support. So I noticed that at least 1 or 2 of you were applying for master's degrees. So I would say that the most common students who apply and who get support are PhD students, but you are eligible as a master's student, but clearly you wouldn't get 3 years of support for a normal master's degree. The support comes in a couple of different ways. So the first and most important part for many of you will be that students who are named as GRFP fellows are given $34,000 a year for 3 years. So that $34,000 a year is in the form of a stipend, which is paid directly to you. In other words, it goes into your bank account and you can do with it as you choose. Obviously, most people who are in a graduate program want to be going to school full time to maximize their engagement and their availability in the program and get through a master's or a PhD as quickly as you can. And so that $34,000 for most students would be used to pay their rent, to pay their food, to pay their insurance costs, to pay all of those sorts of things that all of us have as expenses just as we're living. So it's $34,000 a year for 3 years. So that's already over $100,000 that NSF is contributing towards your education. So that is a great financial deal for those students who receive it. In addition, the students who are named as fellows, there's a cost of education allowance of $12,000 a year that goes to your university. What that means is wherever you are attending your graduate education, NSF sends that university that you're at $12,000 a year for those 3 years that you're supported. What that typically means is that they take that $12,000 that NSF is contributing as a full payment for tuition and fees for you, which means you're going to have a free educational pathway and you're going to be fully supported financially just to support yourself to be a student. So that's a great way to really get through graduate school and ultimately walk out the door with hopefully no debt. And so you're fortunate to be in a field where that's even a possibility, because in certain disciplines, you might be spending 7 or 8 years getting a PhD and none of it is supported by fellowship costs. So if you're able to get one of these, it's a great deal financially, but also it's a great way to sort of distinguish yourself while you're still in graduate school. And if you go on to a research career, which presumably most of you would be if you're going the PhD route, it really sets you up for success as you start to move into your professional world and write grant proposals and get your career kicked off. So it's a great thing for the students who get it. I already mentioned that when NSF sends that money to the university you're attending, typically it means you're not paying tuition and fees. Okay, so the dates for which your applications will be due range from mid to later part of October. And the reason that there's a range of dates there is that there is a different deadline for chemistry than there is for biology, than there is for geo versus physics, etc. So you would have to go on the website to see when the specific deadline is for whatever field you're applying in. All right, and then just to give you a sense of how competitive these applications are, 2 years ago there were slightly more than 12,000 applications, and they gave out 2,000 awards, which if you do that math, that comes out to be about a 16% success rate, which is what it's typically been holding at for a while. Okay, and then in the coming year, in 2022, the number of awards is actually going up by 500 compared to 2019. I have no idea what the number of applications will look like compared to 2019, but the fact that there's 500 more of the fellowships available is a great thing for you as an applicant. Okay, so let's now talk about eligibility to make sure that this works for everybody who's here. And if it doesn't and you want to leave the call, that's totally fine with me. I'm not, no offense taken. But you either have to be a current US citizen or a US national or a permanent resident alien. If you're not a US citizen, then and won't have or any of these other residency statuses, you would not be eligible. So there would be no point in applying if that was the case. For students who are recipients, you must attend a graduate program here in the United States. In other words, if you are an NSF Grfp recipient and you want to attend Oxford University, that's a great plan, but it won't. But NSF won't fund your education at Oxford or anywhere else outside the United States. If you're an undergrad, and I don't think that anybody was an undergrad when I went through this, but if anybody is an undergraduate, you have to graduate by fall of the fellowship start. In other words, if you're applying for a Grfp fellowship to start in the fall of 2022, you must graduate before fall in order to be able to embark on the funded fellowship in the start of fall 2022. So hopefully that makes sense. If you're a graduate student, and most of you, if not all of you are, you can only apply once. So you can either apply in your first year, or if you'd rather, you can wait and apply in your second year of graduate school. I don't know that there's any statistics that show whether it's advantageous to do one over the other. But you'll just simply have to make a decision if you're in your first year, do you want to do it now or do you want to wait and do it in your second year? And whatever your decision is, that's what you proceed with. Okay, one of the things that the National Science Foundation cares about is trying to increase the percentage of underrepresented minorities in the STEM areas. And so each awarding entity, whether it's National Science Foundation or something else, gets gets to spell out what they define as underrepresented. And for NSF specifically, they define underrepresented members of the fields that they support to be females, African Americans, Native Americans, veterans, and those with disabilities. So if you are one of those underrepresented groups, you will receive a slight preference over somebody who does not have one of those things. It will not automatically guarantee success if you can check those boxes, but because this National Science Foundation wants to increase the number of those people in sciences and engineering and the related fields, if two candidates had pretty equal applications and one of them was an underrepresented individual and the other one was not, then the one who is an underrepresented minority might get the nod. Dakota, is that a hand up that I see on your part? If so, go ahead and just unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yeah, sure. I guess one I wanted to point out, I think somebody had a question in the chat. And also for this underrepresented minorities, if we do fall into one of these groups, do you think we should make a nod towards that or some sort of mention in it in our essays or anything like that? Or should we just highlight it when we're actually filling out, when they ask race, ethnicity, that type of stuff?
By all means, you should address it where you're asked for that sort of demographic information. I think if you have a compelling reason to mention it in your narrative in one of the two documents that you are asked to submit, there's certainly no harm in doing that. And I think, the general advice I give to students, not just for this award, but for others, is that if being a member of an underrepresented group has meant that you've had to learn certain strategies to overcome obstacles. And in other words, you've learned how to turn that negative into a positive. That can sometimes be a compelling narrative to include. But at a minimum, it should go in the demographic information when you're answering that, because you want the reviewers to know that. So hopefully that answers your question. I didn't see the other comment in the chat because once I started sharing my screen, all of you guys went to a very small postage stamp on my screen where I can only see about 3 people. So does
Dr.
anyone?
Hansen?
Yeah, Jasmine, go ahead.
Yes, so Tarisha actually did have a question, but I think she's going to save it for the end when you provide some time for questions. So we're all good to keep going.
Either way. All right, that sounds good. All right, so in general, the STEM fields that NSF broadly supports are anything in engineering, the math and physical sciences, geoscience, computer and information science and engineering, bioscience, social behavioral and economic science, education, and human resources. So that's sort of a broader overview. This is the list of things that NSF says they specifically support. So the key things are the STEM fields shown on the left upper side that are in a little bit larger font and bolder. So classic things that you would think of: chemistry, computer science, engineering, geoscience, life science, material research, math, physics, etc. And notice psychology, particular neuroscience stuff, it very clearly fits into this as well. But notice that there's a number of educational pathways that are specifically related to STEM education that are also supported. And notice also that social sciences is included. And this is where the one thing that I mentioned when we first started is notice that down there towards the bottom, there's an urban and regional planning. So this one student who had urban leadership, I think was your major, certainly you will fall under this umbrella. Now, okay, great. So for those people who are on the right-hand side, I will be honest with you and tell you that it's less clear to me exactly what they're looking for from successful students who apply for NSF funding who come from one of the social sciences. My sense is that if your work has some connection to STEM, that's an important part of the story. If you're doing something, say, in political sciences completely unrelated to STEM disciplines or STEM education, then that might be a harder sell. But if you're doing something in political science that deals specifically with STEM issues, then I think you probably have a more compelling reason to pursue pursue an application. If you're in one of those things on the right-hand side and you're unsure, like whether your thing that you want to do makes sense, then I would encourage you to reach out to the NSF. They have a very responsive way of interacting with questions that are posed to them. And so before you go to any trouble of creating an application, I would reach out to them and say, hey, here's my situation. Would this be something that would be considered fundable by NSF? If they say yes, go for it. If they say no, I wouldn't waste my time. Okay, but that hopefully gives you an idea of all of the different disciplines that are covered by the fellowship. All right, so now we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about what the actual application has in it and some of the things that are important on the application. So we already talked a bit in response to Dakota's question about demographics and underrepresented minorities, but there is one part of the application that is really just about demographics, where you provide your information about what your educational pathway has been so far, what degrees you've earned, if any, what your gender is, what your race, ethnicity, where you went to school as an undergraduate, what your GPA was, where you plan on going to grad school if you're still an undergrad, or where you're attending grad school if you're already in grad school. They want to know about your previous work and internship experiences, and as is typical for any of these sorts of things, what sort of honors or awards you've received in the past, if you have any publications, and there's a bit of interest in knowing what sort of offices you've held, more because of their sort of an interest in, you know, what sort of engagement you have in leadership efforts. So let me say a little bit about certain things on this list. So I think for work and internships, the main reason that I think that that's of interest is if your work or internship is related to STEM things, then clearly there's an interest there in hearing about what you've done. If that's not the case, a student's work or internship experience can still be meaningful if, in fact, the student is working 40 hours a week and going to school full time. That tells me something about the student's ability to handle a lot of work and to be successful at that. And that requires discipline and skill. And so there can be times when unrelated work or internships can still be meaningful in helping me understand who the applicant is and how committed they are to things. Under honors and awards, a common mistake that I see on applications is for someone to list honors or scholarships or awards and to simply just provide the name of that thing. But you always want to keep in mind who your audience is and what they know and what they don't know. And so most of the people who are going to review your application are not going to be from the state of Nevada. So if you were a student that attended high school in Nevada and you have a Millennium Scholarship, most people in Nevada have some sense of what that means. But for people outside of Nevada, they would have no knowledge of what it means when you say Millennium Scholar. So the thing you want to do is to provide not just a name of the thing, but enough information that the reviewer can critique how important or how prestigious that is. So if you're a Millennium Scholar, put Millennium Scholar and then very briefly describe it. So I might say, awarded to Nevada high school graduates with a GPA in excess of 3.25. Now you've just shared with the reviewer what that is and why you got it, and they can evaluate that more effectively. Under publications, another thing I always like to point out is that many students think that that means a publication in a peer-reviewed or non-peer-reviewed, but a journal article. And certainly if you have those, you want to list those and list the full citation. But also under publications are any abstracts that you've had that you've submitted that have been accepted. It's also totally appropriate in this topic to include publications that haven't necessarily been fully published yet. But so let's say you've written a manuscript and you've submitted it, you should include that. If you've submitted a manuscript and it's been reviewed and the editor said, we want you to revise this, then you should indicate that. If it's in you've gone through the revision process and is resubmitted but hasn't come out and officially been published yet, you should say, here's the citation for it. It's in press. In other words, include things that are have already been submitted and are under review on up to things that are fully published and in the public domain. So hopefully that makes sense. If not, we can talk about that more at the end. Okay, so the next key part of the application is what's called the personal statement. And the personal statement is limited to 3 pages, and I have a slide of it later on which will talk about what should go into the personal statement, but for now just keep that in mind that the personal statement is 3 pages long. You will also have to submit what's called the research proposal, and it's maxed out at 2 pages. And I have another slide that will talk about what should go into your research proposal here a little later in the presentation. But let me say this about these 2 statements at this point. You want to use the full 2 or 3 pages that you are provided here. Do not submit a personal statement that's 1.5 pages long. Reviewers will critique that and wonder, why are they not using the full allotment of space that we're given them? So try to fill up the space that you're given, but absolutely do not go over this 2 or 3 page limit. The very first review that happens to all applications when they're submitted to NSF is someone at NSF goes through them and looks to see, is the personal statement limited to 3 pages? Is the research proposal limited to 2 pages? If either of those go over onto a 3rd or 4th page, even with 1 word, your application will automatically be kicked out and it will not be reviewed. So pay attention to the page limit and make sure that you use the space that's given to you fully if you can. You'll also have to submit transcripts. If I remember correctly, you can submit an unofficial transcript while you're doing the application. And then if you are accepted or awarded a fellowship, you would have to apply or supply official transcripts, but I think you can get by with unofficial ones when you're doing the application. All applications ideally have 3 letters of recommendation. I believe that they ask you to list up to 5 letter writers, and no application will be reviewed if it doesn't have at least 2 letters of recommendation. I think most people ask for 3 letter writers to submit on their behalf. And as long as 2 people do, you're good to go. If the 3rd one does, even better. But you will need letters of recommendation. And in this case, those should not come from people who are, say, your employer at a job, unless it's a job in a research lab doing things related to what your fellowship's narrative is about. But it should not be, your boss where you worked as a barista at a coffee house, for example. These should be letters from people who know your academic abilities and who know your research interests and abilities, if possible. There is no endorsement required from UNLV. Unlike certain other scholarships where you have to go through a review process at UNLV and only a certain number of students can be nominated and there has to be an official endorsement, there's no such thing for the NSF application. And as many students from UNLV that choose to apply, they can all apply. There's no endorsement requirement. All applications that are submitted are assigned a level that's level 1, 2, 3, or 4. So this really doesn't have any bearing on you. What you do won't change anything here, but I always like to explain this. Students who apply who are still undergraduates are always assigned in level 1. If you are a first-year graduate student, your application will be assigned to level 2. If you are a second-year graduate student, you will be in level 3. And level 4 is for students who have already earned an undergraduate degree, maybe started in graduate school, but for whatever reason, they have stopped out for at least a couple of years and are now hoping to re-enter back into a graduate education program. Those students are in level 4. So the only reason that this is done is that you can imagine that a student who is a senior undergraduate student who's applying may not have as strong of a record as somebody who's already in the second year of their PhD program, for example. And so the reviewers, when they review the applications, they start with students in level 1, so that they are looking at students who've had the least amount of time to accrue a strong record, and they evaluate those applicants sort of comparing apples to apples. In other words, all undergrads, all senior undergrads. Then we move to level 2 applicants, and you expect to see a stronger record, and you then evaluate those students against that group. And same with level 3, and same with level 4. All right, so in the personal statement, so I consider the personal statement and the research proposal to be the 2 most important parts of your application. So in the personal statement, this is where you tell your story, but you tell your story in regards to how it relates to your interest in a STEM career or STEM research. In other words, this should not be some narrative that's unrelated to who you are as a future scientist or engineer. It should be, you want to tell something that informs the reader why you are pursuing this thing. And if there's something in your personal background that pointed you towards a career in this area, then you can talk about that. So I'll give an example from a student who applied from UNLV a few years ago. And he was somebody who grew up here in Las Vegas, and his interest was in amphibians. And he talked about, as a child in Las Vegas, being fascinated by the fact that we get these rainstorms so rarely, and yet when they happen, certain amphibians who hibernate beneath the surface and who are out of sight for most of our lifetimes, all of a sudden with the rain, they come to life, and here are these ponds and puddles and stuff that have amphibians in them that didn't exist before the rainfall. And as a young child, he found that really fascinating. Like, these things were beneath the surface, and then something happened that made them visible. To me, that's a really compelling and interesting way to introduce who he was, where he comes from, and how that sparked his interest, and then move on and talk about what he's doing in that particular field of biology, studying those sorts of organisms. In the statement, you should talk about where you're trying to go career-wise. What are your goals? Do you want to end up as a faculty member? Do you want to end up doing research for Dow Chemicals? What is it? Where do you see yourself? And it should all make sense, the narrative that you spell out. You want to have a clear story about, this is where I'm coming from. These are the kinds of things I've done so far. I want to pursue this particular degree so that I can have a career doing X, Y, or Z, and make a compelling narrative that makes sense as you move forward. Now, one of the things that I frequently share with students when they're doing applications is to come up with a narrative that's linear and that links all the different places that you've come from, where you are, and where you're trying to go. And part of what makes that compelling is that you are painting a picture for the reviewer of who you are, what your motivations are, and where you're trying to go. You want to avoid being ambiguous about where you're trying to go. And for all of us, if you ask me, what are your plans a year from now? What are your plans 3 years from now? What are your plans 5 years from now? Every single step of our paths forward always has potential different pathways that we could go down. And so, it's a common mistake for students to say, well, I could see myself doing either this or doing that, depending on this, certain things. You want to avoid that. You want to think about painting a picture of who you are as a clear, focused, driven person that's trying to pursue a particular path. Now, there's nothing to say that you are committed to that path. Life happens, unexpected things happen in research, and many times our careers go off on totally unexpected trajectories, and that's totally fine. But for the sake of the application, paint a picture for the reviewer of you being a person who's figured out where they're trying to go and understands the way to get from point A to point B successfully. So that's what I mean when I talk about career aspirations, and then how have your past experiences shaped where you're trying to go. In the personal statement, you can talk about the fact that you are an industrial professional experience and those sorts of things, and how that shaped where you're trying to go. if there's a particular project that you did, what was the project? Particularly, what was your role? How did you get involved in that? Where was that done? And then why was that worth doing? So this is where you can sort of reveal your personal underpinnings that cause you to have satisfaction or interest in a particular thing, and that you've figured out what that is, and that you learned that, you know, I really like doing this kind of research because of these things, and it gives me this satisfaction internally to be able to do that. So sharing those kinds of things in the personal statement can be really powerful. And then what did you learn? Did you have any advanced coursework that pertained to that? All these things can be part of your personal statement. And very importantly is this last point about what was your contribution to the project, and then what was your piece of, assuming it was a part of a larger research program, how did your little piece that you did fit into that bigger picture? Okay, so all of that can go into your personal statement. And then in the research statement, this is a more forward-looking part of your application. So this is where you want to describe what you want to do moving forward. So you need to communicate what your research idea is and how you would do it. I am always critical of an application that I review that doesn't have a particular hypothesis stated. So you want to explain what your plan is, what your methods are, what do you expect to learn, how will you know if you've achieved success, what are you going to do next, and then spell out, like, I want to go to this school and do this sort of work, working on this particular aspect of it. This is my hypothesis. Now, if you're an engineer and you don't have a hypothesis, I don't think that's a problem. But for those in the physical sciences, for sure, I would expect to see a hypothesis in the research statement. And then your method should be clear so that the reviewer can go, okay, they have a well thought out plan. And if they carry out those methodologies, I can see how that would generate data that would allow them to say that our hypothesis is either supported or refuted. So you want to include that. Now, that next main point about avoiding jargon is a really important one, because your application will be reviewed by people in your discipline. But to give you an example of why this avoiding jargon matters, the number of panels that are put together by NSF to review the applications depends on the number of applications in each particular field. So in my field, geoscience, there typically would be 2 panels convened, and it would have people from every different subdiscipline in geosciences. And so there's a lot of those. And so the panels will be split into 2 parts that are sort of loosely grouped based on the different subdisciplines. But as a person who does petroleum geochemistry, I might be in a panel where I'm reviewing an application that has to do with climate change science. I'm not an expert in climate change. And so if somebody writes a climate change proposal or research statement that includes a bunch of jargon from that subdiscipline, as a reviewer, I'm going to be like, I don't know what they're talking about. So you want to use appropriate language that conveys relative scientific literacy, but not lose your reader by using jargon that's very specific to your specific subfield. So communicate clearly and think about people that aren't specialists in your specific thing. And then in the research statement, if you have already done some research, like if you're one of those graduate students who's already embarked on your graduate program, if you already have contributions to this project that you're writing about in this research project, by all means, make those clear to the reader. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense as to what the personal statement and the research statement are about. Okay, so once you've written your application and you've submitted all those different pieces that we've talked about, the thing that happens with the reviewers is every NSF proposal, whether you're a student applying for Grfp or if you're an established scientist who's applying to the National Science Foundation for funding, every single proposal that goes through NSF is reviewed for 2 things. The first one is intellectual merit, and I'm going to go through the different things that are evaluated in trying to assess the quality of an application based on intellectual merit. And the other key thing is what's called broader impacts. So I'll go through intellectual merit first, and then we'll switch and we'll talk about broader impacts. So what are we looking for when we talk about intellectual merit? The reviewer is looking for an indication that you have the ability to plan and conduct a viable research project. So they might get a sense of that by what you wrote in your research proposal, or it could be in your publication list. It's clear that you've got multiple publications. You obviously know how to plan and conduct research. So that can come from different places in your application. They want to know about your ability to work both independently and in a team. Almost all science publications, STEM publications today, are published by teams of people rather than individuals. It's much more common that people work in teams. So they're going to want to know that you can work in a team and collaborate with people. But if you can also spell out what your individual piece is and the fact that you can be disciplined and do the work that's required for you independently, that's viewed as a plus. Okay, the ability to interpret and communicate your findings is crucial. So, you know, evidence of that could be that you've already got publications that are out, or that you've presented your research at a conference. And so that ability to share your findings is crucial, because if you're brilliant and you can conduct great research, whether as an individual or part of a team, but never share that, it does society no good. And so that ability to communicate your findings is a really important part of intellectual merit assessment. Obviously, they'll look at your transcripts and look at the strength of your academic record. They'll read your research proposal and evaluate how strong they view that proposal to be. They want to see a description of what you've done before with regards to research. They want to know about your publications and your presentations. And they'll read your letters of references. And this is why it's important that your letter writers be people who are from the research arena, either faculty members or people who are researchers in, say, a company or something like that. They'll look at the appropriateness of the choice of the institution that you want to go to. So I distinctly remember sitting on a panel once where we had this amazing student who was a minority student who wanted to go to Syracuse University to work on vertebrate paleontology. And someone on the panel said, well, why is this student applying to go to Syracuse? They don't have a vertebrate paleontologist on staff there. They have a great invertebrate paleontologist, but that's not what the student is saying they want to do. So there will be people who have that level of knowledge on the panel. And so in that case, the recommendation for this student was, even though it was a great student who had really positive things, the recommendation was to not fund that, because it was like, that doesn't make sense that they would go to that university for that particular thing. All right, and then anything that demonstrates your intellectual ability is part of what a reviewer is looking for with regards to intellectual merit. And then what sort of potential is there for a major achievement within the STEM disciplines? If that's high, that's great. If not, that will be you know, one of the weaker parts of your application. Other things that they look for is, how important is this research that you're proposing? Is this something that's really crucial and important, and will, you know, even minor success will be a significant contribution? That would have more weight than an application that's in sort of an arcane subject that it's not clear why this really would matter to anyone. Now, that can be important research as well, but you're going to have to explain why that would be important and how it would advance knowledge in either your field or across multiple fields. They're going to want to know how qualified you are to conduct the project. And this is where letter writers commenting on your previous work can be a really important thing. Which, let me go off on a tangent for a second. You're going to want to ask your letter writers well in advance if they're willing to write a letter for you. And then I always advocate getting your application done well in advance of the deadline. And when you go to your letter writers and ask them to write their letters, you've got 3 people who ideally are going to be submitting letters for you. If they all talk about the same aspects of you, the reviewer doesn't get as much information. But if one of them talks about one particular part of your record and does that in detail, and if another one talks about something different about you, and the third one talks about even something in addition to what the first two did, now you end up with a broader record that is being presented to the reviewers than if all of them talk about the same thing. Now, you can work with your letter writers and say, hey, are you willing to focus your letter on this part of my past that you know about? And then go to the next one and do a similar thing and sort of split that up. You can't do that if you just generically ask all of them to write a letter at the last minute. So ideally, you want to write your application, share your application with them, share your CV, share your record, send them an email, send them a document that has information about you so that they can pull from all these different things and write a really strong letter for you that covers the kind of things that matter. If you do that, it'll strengthen your application. If not, it won't kill your application, but it's a strategy that makes sense if you can master that. Okay, under intellectual merit, the reviewers are looking for whether this is a creative, new, potentially transformative thing or not. Is it well conceived and organized? Do you have sufficient access to resources? So what that means is if you're planning on doing a project where you're using some huge data set and you need a supercomputer for it, does the university that you're planning on attending or that you're currently attending have that sort of technology? If not, how will you access it? If you fail to mention those kind of things in your application, it will be viewed as a weakness under the intellectual merit aspect of your proposal. International activities are always valued. If your stuff doesn't have an international component to it, don't try to force it. But if you are doing research in another country, or if you have collaborators on a research team that are international, that's viewed as a positive thing. And so if that's the case, mention that, include that. And then lastly, under intellectual merit, is the work that you're going to do transformative? And is it going to change how we see an entire discipline? Will it create a new field? Is it going to disrupt things that we already accept as being the truth? And so those are all things that go into the assessment of intellectual merit. Okay, now we're going to move on to broader impacts. And if I can summarize broader impacts in a single sentence, I would say it this way. Think about if I was a program director at NSF, and I said, I'm going to give you over $100,000 for the next 3 years. Clearly, you are going to benefit from that. But what I want to know when I'm asking about broader impacts is, who else is going to benefit from that? That's what broader impacts is. What is it that you're going to do with this funding that helps other people besides you? So there's lots of ways in which you can speak to broader impacts. So does it advance discovery and understanding while also promoting teaching, training, and learning? In other words, is there a way that you, in doing this research, can be sharing that information with high school students, the public, students in an undergraduate class at your university, where you're promoting teaching, training, and learning that inspires a whole nother generation of STEM students? If so, that funding that we've just given you has broader impacts than just the fact that you're going to have this great financial reward. Well, the activity broaden participation in underrepresented groups. In other words, if you're going to go and present in a high school at a science class, and that happens to be in a particular part of Las Vegas where underrepresented students are a big majority in that high school, that would have great impact in broadening participation of groups that are underrepresented in STEM fields. If you were going to go and do the same presentation at a high school where the majority of students are white students, then that's still great because you're sharing that information broadly with the public, but it would have a slightly less greater impact in broadening the participation of underrepresented groups. Will what you're doing enhance the research and education infrastructure? In other words, if NSF gives you this money, is there any way that you can boost up the facilities at the place that you're working at by helping build instrumentation or build networks or establish new partnerships? Will the results be broadly disseminated to enhance understanding? So a common mistake I see in this regard is for applicants to say, you know, I'm going to do this research, and when I'm done with it, we will publish our results in peer-reviewed journal articles. When you write that, the reviewers roll their eyes, because that is an expectation of everyone in a STEM discipline, is that when you finish your research, you will publish it in peer-reviewed journal articles. If you're not, what's the point of you doing the research? Because nobody knows about it. So what they're looking for here is things beyond the fact that you plan on publishing your research. Okay, other things are how might your research benefit society? So some things fit beautifully under this, others don't. So an example of what I mean by that is if you're a seismologist who's trying to understand the frequency interval of earthquakes on the San Andreas Fault adjacent to Los Angeles, California, well, your research has significant societal impact because there's 10 million people living adjacent to the fault that you're trying to understand better. Someone just had a comment and it went by quickly and it's small, so I didn't see it. So if that's something I should speak to now, please let me know.
You're good to keep going. It was just a link to a feedback survey after the workshop.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jasmine. All right, so the next thing so that's sort of like, let me go back to broader impacts. So one of the things that I look for as a reviewer, and I learned this from hearing how other reviewers critique applications. So I think it's something that everybody on a panel is aware of at some point, is there's sort of 3 different levels of what you're looking for in broader impacts. Some students fail to mention broader impacts entirely. If that's the case, I've never seen one of those applications be awarded a fellowship. Some students have not done anything that constitute broader impacts, but they're aware that they should, and they have a plan for how they will disseminate their research or interact with groups or develop a website or whatever it is that they're going to do that would share their research broader and beyond where they are. So in that case, they have a plan. That's a minimum level of what you're looking for as a reviewer. In the best case scenario, the student has already done these sorts of things, and they articulate a plan for how they will continue to do them if they receive the fellowship. So no broader impact mentioned at all kills a proposal. Having a plan is a minimum. Having a plan and having past experience is the preferred thing to see in an application. So even if you haven't done anything yet, you've still got 2 months. Reach out to a high school, go do some outreach, go talk about what you're doing in your work in your graduate program with high school students, and then talk about that as part of your efforts to share your enthusiasm to a broader audience, and talk about how you'll continue to do that or expand that as you move forward. All right, so next I'm going to point out some things that I think are really important for applications that will rise to the point where they are successful. So you should have some previous research. I don't know that I've ever seen an applicant receive a fellowship if they've done no previous research. You're expected by the point that you're at least a senior or in grad school to have done some research. So if that's missing, that won't work most of the time. So multiple kinds of research is best, but you want to have a linkage between those. What I mean by that is I remember an applicant who had done research projects between each of their undergraduate years. And one of the reviewers was critical of that and said, you know, it just seems like this student was just ticking the boxes because these are 3 unrelated research projects. So you want to avoid that if possible. But if there's a reason why you did those different things, then you want to articulate that. So I remember a different applicant where they had 3 different unrelated things, or at least they weren't all consistent around the same theme. But the student in their application said, after my freshman year, I worked on this research project because I thought this is where I wanted to go career-wise. In doing that research, I realized that I really wasn't that interested in this particular field. And the one part of that project that I found most intriguing was this little piece of it. So in between my next summer, I chose to do a research project focused on that. That is where I hope to go. But one of the things I realized I was missing was expertise in this other thing. So in my third year, I chose to do a research project that incorporated those so that I could really beef up those skills. So if you have multiple things and they're linked, or you can explain what the linkage is if they don't appear to be linked, that's preferred. Okay, if you've given a poster or a talk at a national meeting, that's great. And if you've published, that's even better. So they want to, ideally, they want to see that you've given a talk at your local university and then maybe a regional meeting and a national meetings. In other words, they look for a progression and sophistication of what you're doing. Internal awards, in other words, scholarships from your own university or your department, oftentimes are expected. If that's mixed with some sort of funding from outside of your university, that's considered a recognition of your abilities that goes beyond just at your own place. If you have a strong quality statements, both your personal statement and your research statement, that's important. And you want to be very mindful not to have typos and misspelled words. Reviewers will sometimes kick an application out that has lots of strengths, but has mistakes in it.
Dr. Hansen, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I have a question in the chat. A student has somewhere to be at noon, and she was wondering if she could email you her questions. Am I good to leave your email in the chat?
Absolutely, that's totally fine.
Thank you.
Andrew.hansen@unlv.edu. Yep. All right. Past outreach that you've done, that's important for the broader impacts part of the application. Leadership will be one of those things where if you have it, it's a nice little plus. If you don't have it, it's not going to kill an application. It's just something that's useful. I already talked about using the available space on the 2 documents that you have to write, but I also talked about do not exceed the space limitations. Okay, things that are negative aspects in an application are the things that I'm going to talk about next. So if you've not done any past research, that's a real drawback to success in an application. If you've done previous research, but there's no products to show for that, there's not even an abstract at your university that you gave a talk about, that's considered a weakness as well. If there's a disconnect between what you've done so far and what you plan to do, that can be seen as a weakness, although if there's a compelling reason why you're switching and going off into this new direction and you can articulate that, I think you can overcome that. I mentioned the lack of a hypothesis is something that I don't like to see in a research proposal, and have a plan for how you're going to have those broader impacts. No mention of that, as I said before, is likely not going to get funded. Having a plan is better, and having experience with the plan and that builds on that is the best. Being a geek is great. Do not worry about being like the nerd. That's totally fine. But being socially awkward is something that you want to work on, in part because if you are so shy and so socially awkward that you can't stand up and present your work in front of a group, that's considered a weakness. So geek out all you want, but learn how to interact with people if you are the person who's already socially awkward. And oftentimes the place where that comes out is in the letters of recommendation. So just work on that if that pertains to you. For the students who are current UNLV undergrads, and I'm not sure that there any are, but if you want to stay at UNLV, you have to make it clear why UNLV is the best choice for where you would be able to do the proposed research. All right, and then other things for a successful application. Start early, use the internet, frame your application around a theme or a story. You shouldn't go from one section of an application to another and have like this disjointed patchwork of things. There should be a theme or a narrative that the reviewer, when they're finished reading it, goes like, okay, I have a really clear idea of where this person's coming from, where they are right now, and where they're trying to go. Start your essays with a hook. So what I mean by that is, as a reviewer, you quickly realize that you're going to read a lot of really exceptional applications. And so a couple of things will happen. you'll start to look for reasons to exclude an applicant. In other words, oh, I don't see this, therefore this application isn't as strong. But the applicants that tend to rise to the top are the ones where there's something in their narrative that really grabs your attention and makes you as a reviewer want to see that student get an award. So that will be different for every single student, and your hook is gonna depend on what your narrative is and where you're trying to go. But if you have something that is really interesting, that spells out why you're doing this particular thing, or you have this particular interest and what it got you into it, then think about how you can use that. It has to be legitimate, it can't be fake, and it has to be something that's linked to your main story. You want to link your research proposal to your personal statement if you can. Clearly they will speak to different things, but they also can have some overlap, and that's okay. You want letters to come from people who know you really well. Don't ask for a dean or a president or a provost or somebody with a big title to write you a letter if they don't know you and know specific things about you. Those do not make good letters. If you're getting a letter from somebody who's a new assistant professor at UNLV and they know you really well, that's a great letter. But you probably don't want to get letters from people who are not at least PhD trained people. So if you're in a research lab where there are postdocs and that postdoc is a PhD who's doing research in the lab, that person's totally fine. If the person who knows you best is a graduate student who is not yet have a PhD, you sometimes can have a letter from them that will work well, but find somebody who's the grad student's advisor who will co-sign the letter. That will be more valuable than just having a grad student write a letter for you. Pay attention to the instructions on the application. If you have any questions about it, call the operations center. They're really good about answering questions. And then I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I know we've already gone more than an hour, but I think it's helpful to know a little bit about how the review process works. So each applicant, there's about 30 applicants per reviewer, but the key thing here is in a panel of 30 reviewers, one application will only be reviewed by about 3 people on that panel. And so each application will have at least 3 reviewers review it, and but not everybody on that panel is going to review your application. And then what happens is as a reviewer, you submit your criteria, your critique of the application, and you submit a number of where you rank that student numerically with regards to intellectual merit and broader impacts. All the reviewers do that in advance, and then at NSF, they take all those numerical scores and they do a statistical manipulation called a Z-score, where they figure out, okay, this person might rank applications from a range of 40 to 50. And so 40 is the worst application they had, 50 was their best. Another person might choose to expand their ranking and go, the worst application I had got a 0, and the best application got a 50. So those are not apples and apples, those are apples and oranges. So a Z-score normalizes those different scores to sort of figure out, like, okay, where should these disparate scores compare to each other? And then what the reviewers do when they meet in person, actually it's online, but is they look at where you have an applicant where the Z-scores are very out of skew with each other. Like maybe 2 people ranked this application really high and another person gave it a really low score. You want to know why that happened. So the reviewers, those 3 reviewers will go into a breakout room and discuss what it was that they saw in that application that caused that disparity. And then the reviewers have a chance to say, oh, I didn't see that, I didn't catch that, or oh, that's a really good point, I'm going to change my score. And so that sort of process happens. But only some applicants are discussed. The students who are stellar and have amazing scores are going to rise to the top, and we don't even talk about them. They're probably going to get awards. Students who are poor are going to fall at the bottom. So the applications that we spend the most time on are ones that are right at the border between, is this a recipient or is this somebody that gets an honorable mention? And so that's where you spend most of your time reviewing the applicants, because those are the differences that are going to make things. So for the people who go into those breakout rooms to discuss an applicant, that's no more than 7 minutes. So you have all these different applications and you got to get through it in a reasonable time. And so that gives you some sense of how that review process works. You can't control any of that, but I think it's helpful to know. You'll submit your applications via research.gov website. And I think I've covered the key points I wanted to cover. I think that third bullet point is important. The process can be really beneficial to you, even if you don't get an award. I've worked with hundreds, if not thousands, of UNLV students applying for a variety of different opportunities like this. And I think in almost every case, it really helps them to go through the process, to learn how to articulate what it is that their interest is, what they're trying to do, and how they're going about it. And in many cases, it helps the student sort of figure out and refine what it is exactly they want to do career-wise. This will make you sort of get down in the weeds and figure out exactly what it is you want to do and where you're trying to go, and to be able to articulate that. So there's benefits in just doing the process, even if you don't get the award. But I know we have some questions from the chat, so I'm going to stop talking and we'll go to those next, if that works.
Okay, so if anyone has any questions now, they can feel free to chime in either with their mic or in the chat.
And I'm going to stop sharing if I can.
Hi, Dr. Hansen. Yeah, I had actually I have a few questions. I'll just do one at a time in case anybody else has some. I guess this is more specific to just myself. I'm technically still undergraduate, even though I'm in that integrated BSMS program. So in relation to this application, I would be considering an undergrad. So I am able to apply now, and then if I don't get it, I would also be able to apply the first and second years of my grad program. Is that correct?
You know, they used to do this differently, and so I want to make sure I give you the correct information. It used to be that a student could apply as a senior. If they didn't get it, they could apply again in their first year or apply again in their second year. And if I remember correctly, Dakota, but I would want to go to the website just to verify this. I believe that you can apply as an undergraduate, and if you don't get it, you can still apply once as a graduate student, but you cannot apply 2 times as a graduate student.
Okay, that makes sense. I appreciate it.
Okay, Dr. Hansen, there's another question.
I did, but I'll
would
let
you
you go first.
Oh,
okay, perfect. So I'm just going to ask Kevin's question. It is, if you receive the award, what obligations will you have for the next 3 years?
That's a great question. So the 3 years that you are supported on a GRFP do not have to be the first 3 years after you are given the award. So so you can spread that out if it makes sense to do that. And so you'll want to work with the faculty advisor in the graduate program that you're going to, and if they were already planning on admitting you with an assistantship, for example, and you can have that funding for your first year and then move on to the NSF funding for your second, third, and fourth years, maybe that makes sense. If it makes more sense for you to get started on your research earlier and not have the requirement to be a graduate assistantship, then maybe you want to start your research project and you're funding your first and second years, and then have the school commit to funding you as a GA, a graduate assistantship, in your third and fourth year, and use your last year of NSF funding for your fifth and final year, if that's what your plan is. So you can sort of spread it out as it makes sense for you and the department that you're in and what sort of support they have. I don't know that I fully answered that question, but hopefully I hit the main point there.
Did you want to ask another question, Dakota?
Sure, yeah. So in that presentation, you made mention to the facilities available at the graduate school that you're going to be in. So in our personal statement or the research statement, should we list all of our possible grad schools, like our top 3 or top 4, and like why we want to go there?
No, I think so this is where, and I'm glad you asked this question. I would choose a specific place and a specific project that you ideally would want to go to and talk about that. So one of the things that I frequently do with students in this regard is to say, okay, let's imagine a time in the future when you are done with your last degree and you are working your dream job. Everything has worked out and you are doing exactly what you would hope to be doing at some point in the future. If you can articulate that, then the thing that I have students do is like, okay, find somebody who's doing that sort of work today. And what was the roadmap that got them there? Because if you can follow that same path, you're going to end up in the place you want to get to. So you want to look at it and go, well, what degree did they get? Where did they go to school? Who was their advisor? What did they work on? What was the place they came from? And now you've just defined a roadmap for how you can get from where you are now to where you ideally want to be. And then in your application, you have a very clear narrative about here's where I am now. I want to go on and get this degree at this school, working on this thing, ideally in Professor so-and-so's research group, because ultimately I want to work on this thing, and that's what I hope to have my career in. And so when you do that, you've just presented a very clear vision of who you are and where you're trying to go. That is way better than saying, I would be interested in going to any of these different things, doing any of these different options. Because when a reviewer sees that, they're like, well, I don't really know where Dakota's going to go, if that's the
Sure.
idea.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I appreciate the feedback. One last question. I don't have any publications at the moment, but I did, I had the internship with NREL over the summer. I made a poster. I presented the poster within NREL's group. Should I include those
That's the
documents in
publication.
the application? Okay.
That is a publication. You want to list that poster, and if there's some way you can cite that, like if there was a booklet or something that was produced at the end of the summer that has your listed there, that's your citation. So you will list it as an abstract or a poster or whatever it was.
All right, I'll have to look into it because I don't think it's posted anywhere within NREL, but
even if not, still include it. And so like a lot of students will present a lot of UNLV students will present their research at the OUR symposium, the Office of Undergraduate Research Symposium. And in that case, I think there's probably a website that they could cite. But even if there wasn't, they could just simply say, this is a presentation at the Office of Undergraduate Research Symposium held at UNLV on such and such a date. Here's the name of the poster or the abstract. Here's the list of authors. Just give as much of the citation information as you can.
Okay. So yeah, I did the poster and I also made a report. You're saying the poster would probably be the better option?
I would say list both of them.
Okay. Perfect. I will do that then. All right, that's all the questions I had. I appreciate all the info. This is helpful, and I guess I'll be in touch.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Dakota.
Bye-bye.
And thanks to Jasmine and Nevina.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Awesome.
Hansen.
So,
All right.
before we end today's session, I'd just like to say thank you to Dr. Hansen and thank you to all the participants for joining us. Before you log off, if you could take a look in the chat, there is a workshop feedback survey link that we'd like for you guys to complete if you can. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jasmine.
Thank you so much.
Bye, you guys.